All right, welcome back to Appsmith Innovate, part of our Hacktoberfest 2023 event. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith, and I'm excited to be here today bringing you 10 tricks in 10 minutes. So we're going to go through 10 different tricks that you can use in your apps, in your submissions for Hacktoberfest. We'll show you how each one of them works, then you can fork the app and actually use these tricks in your submission. So let's check out the video. We've got a dynamic menu button. Now this is a feature built into the menu button. It's not so much a hack or a trick, but it's a little tricky to figure out how to use it, and I've created a function that makes it a little easier. So we're going to take a look at how to automatically generate the options in a menu button based on your data, based on a condition or a function, and to populate those items in the menu. That's part of it, but then also how do you connect each option to a different function dynamically and have that just be generated from your data. So we'll look at how to use the dynamic menu button feature and feed it from your data. Now, the menu button has an option for a dynamic input. So this is a built-in feature. It's not so much a trick or a hack, but it's a little tricky to figure out how to use this in a way that's totally dynamic with different buttons. So you can see this one's hard-coded. This is a standard menu button using the static menu items, and it comes with these first, second, third, and then I added one. Here we've got a dynamic one, and this can be driven by your data. So you have a query that runs and you want it to show a different option for every department or some set of found records, and it's just going to update automatically based on the results, right? That's a dynamic menu button. So let's see how it works. First, the standard menu button, when you have it set to static, each one of these options are configurable. You can reorder them. You can change what actions they will do and how they look. But to use the dynamic one, once you select dynamic here, there's just this source data and then a configuration. So to use this properly, we'll look at this second button here. Now I've got a JS object that is returning a config. So this just wants some data. X number of rows, one for every button, and you can configure this however you want. It can be the results of your query, or it can be some extra setup. So what I'm doing, I've got this menu button config, and I've got 3 different functions with a label and a color. And then I have 3 different functions here that can be run. So this is just populating the list of items in my button. And then here's the 3 functions I want to run. All right. So on this menu button, you set it to dynamic and you give it some data. Now this has an array of objects with a label telling it what function to run and a color. On the style, I can reference that color on the individual button. So this is menu button 2, and if we go to configure the individual menu items, you'll see that the style is just referencing the current item.color. So in the array of data going into this dynamic menu button here, current item is just whichever entry in this set that you've provided. And so I can reference the color here to make each one of them have a different color per entry. The label is coming from that property. And then the on-click says to go to JS object 1 and find the function named whatever that label is. So it's using bracket notation to dynamically reference some function inside JS object 1. This gets passed in, it finds that function, and then runs it. And so we're able to have different functions that run for each entry. And you'll see that this one says it ran function 1 and I'm showing it as an error. I show this one as a warning, and the final, all of these are just calling the same show alert, but with a different function, with a parameter saying to display it as a info or a warning or error. So you can see that each one ran a different function by name just by passing in that value. So if you've ever used the number slider, you've probably noticed that you have to manually type in all of the steps, the labels and the values if you want something besides those defaults. And if you're trying to go from say 0 to 100 with steps of 2 or 5, that's a lot to type out. And then if you decide you want to change that, then you've got to go change all of those steps again. So we're going to look at how to use Lodash to automatically populate those steps and keep it updated automatically if you change the min or the max or the step size. So the standard number slider here, if you want something different besides these 25, 50, and 75 marks, then you'll have to manually edit these steps in the marks here. And if you wanted to go every 2% or 5% all the way to 100, it would be a lot to type out here. And every time you change this, if you decide you want something different, you'd have to edit it again. So with this slider, if I change the step size here to 5, you'll see all the numbers automatically generate. You can change this to 10, and we go to steps of every 1. So this is updating automatically on the fly. And you can see there are no JS objects in this app. This widget is doing it by itself, by referencing itself. So I'm looking at the min, max, and the step size properties. And then I'm using Lodash. So Appsmith comes with Lodash. We have other libraries you can import, but Lodash is there by default. And the range function will create a range of values, starting at a min, going to some max, and using a step size. And then I map over that array. So this creates just an array of the range numbers, and then map that to an array of label values. All right, next up we're going to look at how to run a function by name. So sometimes you want to take an input, and based on a condition you want to process it one way, and then based on another condition maybe you want to run it a different way, but you're still always wanting to take that same input and return it to the same output, right? So you've got these helper functions in the middle. That's what we're going to check out, how you can take the name of the function, find the right one, run it, and then return whatever function you want based on the name. All right, next up, we've got running a function by name. So sometimes you've got multiple functions. You want to take different inputs and run a different function on it based on some condition. So here I've got the min value from this data set. And then I've got a separate button for the max and a separate button for an average. But what if you needed to dynamically call a function and you had 10 or 20 or 100? If you want to just take the name of the function as a single input and find that function and run it. So that's what we're talking about here. We've got a drop down with a list of values, and by selecting a value here, it's going to run the function with that name. So rather than 3 or 4 or however many buttons, you can do this all with one widget. So let's check it out in the editor. And the trigger for this drop down here, it's saying to run a function, JSObject1, a function by name, and using bracket notation. So look here, and I've got a function that takes the name it's given. It's taking it from that select option, and it just runs this function. It's finding the function with that name and then running it. So the bracket notation says go to this object, JSObject1, and find the function with the name that I just passed in, and then run it. And I save that as a result back that's defined up here. So I define the result to begin with, and it's null. And then once the page loads, you can run any function to update that value. All right, next up, we're going to check out how to programmatically create HTML elements. So you can't directly access the DOM of the Appsmith app, of the editor, but you can create new elements and then add properties to those elements, change its attributes, customize it however you want, and then return that element and display it in an iframe. So we're going to see how you can first create different elements and then programmatically loop over some data, manipulate it, do something cool with it, and then display it in an iframe. All right, next we have creating an element using JavaScript. So what are we looking at here? We've got a map widget. There's some random numbers here. You can randomly generate new positions, and it plots the positions all over this background image here. So it's kind of a map widget with a XY plot. But that's not the trick here. This is just an example, one way that you can programmatically create elements using JavaScript. So let's see how this works in the editor. All right, I've got some sample data here. I have a function that runs on page load to populate it, and I've got a function that will generate the random array of data for me. So this is just a random, it generates a number within a range and gives me back an X and a Y and picks a person. So that's not the real trick here though. What I want to show you is that you can programmatically create an HTML element. So this function, this is going to take the data and it says div is document.createElement. Okay, you cannot access elements within the Appsmith editor here. Let me go to the inspector. And so all of these elements on the page of the app here, for security, you can't access that inside of the editor. You can't write a function that's going to start manipulating this code and bypass what your app logic is supposed to be doing, but you can create a new element. You can define a new div and then start to manipulate it and add style and loop over it and do different things. So here I am looping over the data, and for each point in that data, I'm adding a dot and giving it a position and a percent and a color. And then I'm able to loop over again and add the labels, and then finally return that element and display it in an iframe widget here. So the real trick is that you can programmatically create HTML elements, manipulate them, loop over data, and then return that final element and display it in an iframe. All right, next up we have object to table or list. So if you've ever had a row of data with a whole bunch of columns and you want to display it laid out side by side, you can do that one at a time with a bunch of different widgets, but one, it's difficult. It takes a long time to bind all of those. And two, it's not dynamic. So if your data changes, if the number of columns change, then your layout doesn't work anymore. So what we're going to do is look at a way to take your data and rotate it, kind of create a pivot table and take that one row of data, turn it into a bunch of rows so that you can display it in a table widget or a list. So let's say you've got a table with a bunch of columns, and rather than trying to display all of this sideways with this scroll, you want to be able to display it top to bottom. And there's a few different ways you can do this with a table widget or a list widget. It's a little tricky to understand the code, but it's very easy to just copy and paste it and use it. So we'll walk through how it works. You can start out with taking the selected row from a table, and then we're going to reduce that using JavaScript. Start out with an empty object, go over each column in the data, and turn that into a new row so it can be displayed in a table widget or a list. All right, so this works by reducing an object to a row, and it takes an object and then it returns an array of property value pairs. Now, a reduce in JavaScript, a reduce function, it takes a function as the first parameter, and it takes a optional default value for the first loop. And so what this is doing says the first loop, start out with an empty array, and then go over every point of the data and run this function, which concatenates in new object with that label and value. And so by the last row, after it's gone through every point in the data, it's taking the keys from that object and reducing it to a new array. Now you can display this in a table widget easily just by referencing the data, give it an object, turn it into an array of rows. In a list widget, you can connect the data to the list itself and then use individual widgets to bind to the current item and then whatever property. Here, I'm using the property for the left side to give everything a label, and all of the data points are on the right, but in case it's an image, I actually have an image version of it and then the text version, and I'm conditionally showing and hiding. So if I look at the preview here, and then you can see that there's not a bunch of blank image columns here. It's hiding the image when there isn't one, but you can conditionally show it in the list if it is an image type column. All right, next we have table summary row. So the table widget's awesome. It's got a bunch of cool features, but when it comes to displaying summaries of that data, you've got to write your own function and then figure out how to display it in there. So we're going to look at two different ways that you can display the summary data and calculate it. I've got options here for finding the number of unique values, the average, the min, the max, and then you can take those values and display it either as a new row in the table widget or display it separately in another widget. All right, have you ever wanted to add a row to the bottom of your table or maybe a separate row at the top showing all of the unique values or min, max, or total from each column? So we're going to see how to do that with JavaScript. You can build an interface like this that's a little more complex and lets the user select it, or you could just hard code it and put the max at the bottom of every row. So this is built pretty versatile that you can modify it and just pass in some parameters to change the functionality for your use case. All right, let's check it out in the editor. So I've got my table of data here. This is just the raw data, and I've got a separate file here for the sample data. So this just gives me a couple different data types, a list, a text, Boolean, and there's nothing else going on in this file, just the sample data. Here I've got a function that creates the table summary. So given the calc type, take this data and I tell it which column is the ID because it doesn't really make sense to create a total or an average of your ID. And so that's where I display just the label of what it is I'm doing here. This says total in the ID column. And if I choose min, now it uses that position to say these are all min values. So that's what's going on there. And then I'm taking the keys from that first data set and looping over them. So as I loop over, the thing that I want to do with that value is dependent on the calc type. If I am working with a number or a Boolean, then here's how I'm going to handle it. And if it's a string, then I want to do it this way. So this is a nested logic using a switch that says for these file types or data types rather, run this type of calculation during the loop. If it's a string, do this, and then if it's none of those, it will insert NA. At the end of that, then it takes that summary data and concatenates it onto the original data so that you get that extra row added to the table. Now I'm using Lodash here with multiple functions. I've got one that easily finds all the unique values from a column. There's a Lodash function to sort all of that and then pick the min or the max. I'm using count by here to get the total. And then head. This one is a little tricky, but check out the Lodash docs. We've got Lodash built into Appsmith by default. And if you look at the libraries over here, there's a link straight to the docs so that you can figure out how to use these functions. Like I said, this one is a little tricky. I'm not going to explain it on this call, but it basically chains all those together and gives you a cleaner way to write that format. All right, this one's one of my favorites. So the iframe has two different ways you can send messages back and forth. You can either post a message from the iframe out to Appsmith, or Appsmith can post a message to the iframe itself. So it's kind of like a single point of communication, and if you want to be able to run different functions or pass different data and do different things based on what data is sent, that's what we're going to check out. You can use that post message function from the iframe back to Appsmith and posting a message from Appsmith to the iframe and tell it what function to run. So we're going to look at a way to wrap your data and tell it what function you want it to run with that data, and then create kind of a two-way communication between Appsmith and the iframe, and you can tell it exactly what to do with the data. All right, next we have iframe two-way dynamic function calls. What is this about? So the iframe can support two-way communication. You can post a message into the iframe and it can post a message back to Appsmith. But what do you do with that data? And what if you want to do something different depending on the data? And you want to run one function for some use cases, and other times you want to post data out of the iframe and do something different with it. So that's what this is about. Here I've got this selected to update data in the iframe, and as I select a new row, it updates this data at the top half here. Now you'll see if I select update text, selecting a row is now updating this text down below. Both of these options are pushing data to the iframe, posting a message, but I'm also telling it what to do with that data. And so the iframe is behaving differently in each case. Now I've also got this working in the other direction. I can click save and we end up with the data here. I can clear this and now it knows that the function that was ran is clear and there is no data along with it because we've cleared it. Type something else in here and save. So now the function that was clicked is button save, and here's the data that goes with it. So you can handle it differently. Data going in and out dynamically and calling different functions based on some wrapper. You wrap the data with this object and you say that the function to run with it is button save or whatever you want to call it. Let's check out how it works in the editor. So you can see I've broken this into multiple files. I'm just using template literals and most of it's hard-coded. I pick up the app's primary color and then the rest of it's just hard-coded CSS. That gets merged in with the script and the source here. So I've got most of my HTML is hard-coded and then I just pick up these other files referenced as a inline style tag or inline script tag. And then the script, the behavior of this iframe. So I've used the same technique as the dynamic function call and the dynamic menu, where I have an object that has multiple named functions inside of it. But instead of it being a JS object in Appsmith, it is a object in my code, in the iframe itself. So post functions is an object and it contains named functions that you can run by name using post functions bracket notation and pass in that function name. Same approach, same technique, just inside the iframe. Now, when a message is received, we want to parse that data, see if it's an actual object and has a message.function property, and then look to see if there's a post functions with that name. So we receive a message, look for message.function, then look for a function with that name, and if there is one, run it and pass that message to it. So it can always take whatever one entry point, that same posting a message, and as long as it's an object and it has a dot function, then it will find that function and run it. Then we add an event listener so that every time a message is received, it will run this function. And then lastly, this part is the functionality inside the iframe to have that button for clearing or adding some sample text or saving. And this just posts a message to the parent window, back to Appsmith. So this says window.parent, which is Appsmith. It receives the message, and this second option here is just saying to allow from other domains. Did you know that the text widget can display HTML tags? All right, this one's pretty cool. So there's a few tags that'll work inside of a text widget. Not all of them, but there's some that are really useful. So we're gonna show you how to use it to add styling, even some kind of effects, and a few really unexpected ones I didn't think were gonna work. All right, next we have HTML tags inside a text widget. This one is crazy. There's some really cool stuff you can do here. All of this is one text widget. This header, I've got some plain text, then there's bold. These are separate stylings, but all one text widget. This horizontal rule and even this image are all inside a single text widget here. Okay, I've got some inline styling here on this one and even a details tag with an image in it. You can have these expanding collapse containers. This is just a text widget with a details tag. You can also do ordered and unordered lists. So let's check out how to set this up and what actually works and what doesn't, because you cannot use every HTML tag. There's a lot of things that are going to be blocked for security and that just wouldn't work in the app editor here. But when it comes to style tags, H tags, paragraph, horizontal rule, I'm using EM tags here for italics, and even an image tag, and the size works too. So this image was not the right size that I wanted, and I found that I could add the style tag because that was too big there. So You cannot do CSS on a text widget. You can't type some styles here after outside of the tag, but if you do it inside the tag as a style attribute, then it does work. You can even do inline styles here for color, font. You can do details tags. These expand and collapse. So you've got details wrapping the entire element, and then a summary to show the text when it's collapsed, and then some inner content. And you can put whatever other tags you want inside of here. Also got ordered and unordered lists, so there are tons of options. Keep in mind that the images, it's kind of a surprise there that this works. It's not officially supported, but it looks like it's working, so a lot of cool things you can do with it. Love to see what the community comes up with. Let us know how you use this. All right, next we have data-driven SVGs. I got a little help from ChatGPT on this one and came up with a few templates for an SVG, and then used JavaScript to swap out certain parts of it and make it dynamic so that I can select different rows of my data and then generate SVGs. I've got two different cool use cases to show you, but I'm sure there are a ton more you guys can come up with. This app is taking data and automatically on the fly generating these images right there in the user's app. So these images, these initials and these tags here, they're not images on a server somewhere. They're just generated as needed on the fly from your data. And I've got this set up to automatically pick colors with proper contrast. It picks the exact same color for the same word every time, but a different color for the next word, different for casing as well. And so every time Michael comes up here, it'll be red. Every time Jim comes up, it's blue. But you don't have to think about that. And the contrast is set, it's automatic. I got a lot of help from Taurus on our design team for this one. Really appreciate it. And I'm excited to show you guys how it works. All right, first I have a function that converts a string to a number. It just takes the string, adds up all the character codes, and then it finds the modulus of that total there. I'm using 46 because there's 45 colors, and I want it to roll over after that last one. It finds the color that corresponds to this number. So a string has some unique value that it adds up to. Then I roll that number around for X number for each color here, and every number becomes a color. Then I've got two different functions, one for the fills or the tags and one for the initials. Each of them just take the input string. I'm either going to split it by commas for the tags or turn it into initials for the circles. And so once I know the text string, then I merge it in an SVG using template literals and just fill in the color, the text, the background, and return it, and then display it in a table or a list widget or even an image widget directly. And finally, we have nested forms. So some of you may have seen the collapsible containers or the stepped container that we've shared in Discord before. This is kind of a variation on that. It combines a whole bunch of different techniques to create a form with sections that you can expand and collapse. There's validation checks for each individual section. We've got a slider across the top that shows the progress, and everything's wired and connected. So it's really cool. I'm excited to share this one. So you may have seen the collapsible containers or the stepped container that we shared in the community recently. This is a similar technique. It's a little more advanced. It's got a bunch of different things tied together, and the end here is that we've created sections to a form where each section can be expanded and collapsed. You can navigate by the slider across the top, or you can individually open and close the sections here. There's also validation for each section. So as this section becomes valid, the checkbox appears here, and you can advance from within the step. This collapses step 1 and opens step 2. Now this one's valid and checked off, and it advances to the next one. So all of this is wired together for a really cool effect of a stepped form. Let's check out how it works. I started out by defining this initial state where some section is selected and they are all collapsed. So initially all these are false, and then which one is selected. And then I have a function that says, if this is your current selection and this is the one you want to go to, then you just set the show state. Set one of them to true, set the other one to false, and then update this selected section. And that helps display it. Right here on this category slider, I want to be able to show the default one and have that update automatically. And so its default value is that selected section. And as I change that with all of these triggers, on click keeps saying run that function and update that selected section. And so I can show and hide the green. The green containers are the widget that's being shown and hide optionally. And then the red container here, this is auto height. So as its contents, the green, is hidden, then the red container collapses. And so the effect is, as you're in this view here, you can conditionally show and hide the contents, and all of those will expand and collapse. Now, I've got triggers coming from the title here, or from the slider, or from the next button in the form. And they're all connected to show and hide and expand different sections. All right, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this session of Appsmith Innovate. Let's check back in with the team and see what's up next.